On September 7th, 1982, it was a cloudy day in Craig, Alaska. The morning was shrouded in a blanket of fog so dense that ships had to use radar to maneuver through harbor safely. A few days prior, Labor Day weekend, the fishermen had all converged on Craig after weeks and weeks of nonstop fishing. This morning, something was amiss. A 58-foot, state-of-the-art, $850,000 commercial fishing vessel was adrift off of Fish Egg Island in Craig, Alaska. It sat there in the waters of Ben's Cove, bobbing like a buoy. By the afternoon, that boat, the Investor, was in flames. It started out slow, but when the fire caught, an explosion could be heard. The smoke was visible for miles. Boats began to converge on the burning Investor as the fire consumed the boat. Flames engulfed the wheelhouse, the living quarters, and within 15 minutes, the entire back deck was ablaze. There was no way to put out the fire because Craig, Alaska simply lacked resources, it seems. They just didn't have the means of dealing with a fire of this magnitude quickly. But when the flames were beat down, a storm was about to be unleashed on the tiny town of Craig, Alaska. Alaska State Trooper Anderson was the first official on the scene. He sprinted across town and tried several different ways to extinguish the fire. And when the flames were drawn down about 4 hours later, he decided to conduct a preliminary investigation. Did the owner of this boat have a bad fishing season and decide to burn the costly vessel for insurance money? One of the volunteers walking the smoldering ruins of the Investor went into an area where the galley door would be. Something oozed up in the debris. He described it as some warm gel-like substance, like you would see the gelatin from a cherry pie filling that you would get out of a can. That's when they saw it. They thought it was a deer carcass or an animal laying on its side with its legs sticking straight out. Totally unrecognizable, with just some burnt tissue and gut material hanging out. Trooper Anderson realized this was no dog, no deer, no animal. These burnt remains were human, and it wasn't long before they found more. Before nightfall, the bodies and parts of the bodies of Mark Colthurst, his pregnant wife Irene Colthurst, his 5-year-old daughter Kimberly Colthurst, and another adult were found. Under a midnight moon, with the body count at 4, Trooper Anderson decides to call off the search. We would later learn that the body count would rise. Not only rise, it would double. Before the tired Trooper Anderson leaves to go home, a police officer from Craig told him he had a witness. Trooper Anderson talks to his first witness, an E.C. Phillips cold storage employee. This young man was on his way to the fire when his boat ran out of gas, but he noticed something strange. The fire had just started, and it seemed like everyone was going out toward the fire except this skiff. This skiff was headed in the opposite direction, toward the dock, and it seemed like he could care less about the fire. The description the witness gave was brown or blonde hair, a man in his early 20s, maybe 21. His weight was maybe 150 pounds. He was unsure of his height because he was sitting down in the skiff. He did note he was wearing a baseball hat with an emblem on it. He also thought the guy was wearing glasses. After getting this statement, Trooper Anderson goes and checks out the skiff. He examined it briefly and decided not to fingerprint it because it was raining. What Trooper Anderson didn't know was this was not just any skiff. This was the power skiff that belonged to the Investor, the same boat that he had just recovered 4 burned bodies from. Whoever drove this skiff was a cold-blooded killer. You're listening to True Crime Tuesday with your host, Gray Area. To get to the heart of this story and to uncover the layers, we need to first look at the tiny town of Craig, Alaska. Alaska is regarded by most as the last frontier. It's rugged and wild and cold. A hot day in Alaska is about 63 degrees. It's peppered with glaciers and countless rivers and lakes and majestic mountain peaks, active volcanoes, and 34,000 miles of tidal shoreline. Alaska was originally settled by people who crossed the Bering Land Bridge. It would later become populated by various groups of Eskimos and Native American groups. In 1867, an American flag was raised over Alaska, and 30 years later, gold was discovered, and so began the Klondike Gold Rush. But even better than gold, there were fish. Fishing for profit or commercial fishing is an old practice in Alaska. It can be lucrative, but also it's one of the most dangerous jobs in the world. Summer in Alaska, during salmon season, small towns like Craig would boom. Docks would be covered with fishermen unloading their catches as they maneuvered between openers and closures of the salmon fishing season. So Craig, Alaska is this small island off of the west coast of Prince of Wales Island. You can access the island only by float plane or boat, but it's an isolated fishing town, and in 1982 the population was only 572. 572 people. That's not a lot of people. Currently, the high school only has 80 students in total, which breaks down to about 20 students in each graduating class. It's a small town. In towns like that, everyone knows everything or knows someone that knows someone that knows something. The things just don't happen of this magnitude in a town like Craig without going unnoticed. Someone knows something. Between boats and crew and seasonal workers, salmon season in Craig, Alaska did indeed double the population. Hundreds of fishing boats were in and out of harbor all season. The Investor was a seine boat or a seiner, state of the art and almost brand new. It was 58 foot long, the limit allowed by Alaska law. It stood out in the harbor. It was like a Lamborghini. On Sunday, September 5th, 1982, the Investor pulled into harbor as the lucrative salmon season was winding down with a broom tied to their mast, letting it be known the Investor had killed it with a clean sweep. It's a Navy thing, but fishermen tie a broom to their mast to indicate that they had caught 100,000 fish. The Investor pulled into Craig with 77,000 pounds of salmon, valued at about $33,000. The crew unloaded the salmon at Holbeck Seafood Tender. September 5th also happened to be Mark Colthurst's 28th birthday. Mark Colthurst is the owner and skipper of the 58-foot boat, the Investor. After the fish were unloaded, the Investor pulled into the crowded dock area in Craig. The docks were so packed full of fishing vessels that boats had to be tied to other boats. The Investor was tied to the Decade that was tied to another boat, Defiant, which was tied to the dock. So Mark gave his crew of 4 teenage boys the night off, telling them to be back tomorrow at noon. The 4 crew members climbed over the rails of the Investor, walked across the deck of the Decade, and then had to cross over the Defiant's deck before reaching the dock and going in town to enjoy the rest of the night off. That evening, Mark and his family had a birthday dinner at a restaurant on Craig called Ruth Ann's. They had a meal and several rounds of drinks before returning to the ship. Irene Colthurst and the children were set to leave Craig in the morning. School was about to start, and Kimberly and Johnny needed to be home in Blaine, Washington for school. We know that Mark had borrowed $100 from a fisherman friend to pay for his dinner because he didn't have cash. He did just unload 77,000 pounds of fish, but Mark never took cash payments. He would instead wait for a lump sum at the end of the season, and even then it wouldn't be a cash transaction. Checks were used. But there was also another thing. A waitress or cook reported that Mark got into an argument with someone while he was at Ruth Ann's. The waitress says the person entered while she was clearing off the table and an argument ensued. We know that 2 crew members of the Investor, Dean Moon and Jerome Keown, headed towards town together, and they both made calls to their family and smoked a little weed. The Coulter's family left Ruth Ann's around 9:30. At 10:30 p.m., 4-year-old Johnny Coulthurst stuck his head inside the pilot house of the ship the Investor was tied to, Decade, and said hi to a crewman he had played with earlier that day. But sometime after that, something went horribly wrong. Mark Coulthurst and his wife, Irene Coulthurst, were high school sweethearts that built their fishing empire from the ground up. He wasn't a generational fisherman. He was a guy that fell in love with fishing and, in his words, diversified and maximized, starting small and growing. One time he caught $100,000 worth of fish in a week. His crew, Michael Stewart, was his cousin. Chris Heyman was the son of one of his friends. Dean Moon had worked with Mark for many seasons. Jerome Keown had just joined the Investor crew in August, a few weeks prior to the fire. They were all incredibly young teenage boys with their entire lives in front of them. The investigation fell in the laps of Sergeant Stodstill and Sergeant Miller, starting on the 8th of September. So when they arrived, the boat was still smoldering. The police chief and Craig suggested to use some fire foam to put the fire out the rest of the way, and the fire was finally put out for good. I find it unbelievable that a fire would be permitted to continuously burn crucial evidence at a crime scene. The investigators moved debris and shoveled ash onto shrimp screens to shift through the rubble. It was a laborious process, and the boat was so badly burned, and the water was also a factor. They would fill 40 to 50 pound fish tubs with debris and sift through it. So during the investigation, they would find the remnants of a firearm, a rifle, still tucked in the remains of a storage locker. They found the remnants of a fire extinguisher with the activation pin still intact. They found bones and bone fragments, and they also found another body. It was substantially burned. It was a chest wall and a few ribs. Nearby, they found an arm. They kept moving and found additional bones. They would find a foot and 2 leg bones and more fragments. When they reached the engine room of the Investor, the investigation continued. Delta Marine, the manufacturer of the boat, had sent their own people down to inspect this boat. This is kind of typical. They need to make sure they didn't sell a faulty boat that had some kind of engine fire or electrical fire, but they also were there to assist with the investigation. The inspectors from Delta Marine noticed something crucial. The seacocks or butterfly valves were all left open. This is a no-no. With these valves opened, water is being pumped into the fish hold, and it's never used when the fish hold is empty, and never were all the valves open at once. The investigators had reached a conclusion. Someone tried to sink the ship, and when it didn't work, they went back and set it on fire. Another important discovery was the skiff pins being broken. The Investor had a skiff, which is a small boat that has an outboard motor, a motor that hangs off the back of the boat. The Investor, being the top of the line liner that she was, it had a hydraulic skiff ramp, and the ramp had been damaged, and the skiff was forced off of the ramp. The person who took that skiff was in a hurry. The person that took that skiff was a killer. It was later determined after autopsy that the Coulthursts were shot multiple times with a .22 caliber weapon. 3 bodies were identified immediately as Mark, Irene, and their daughter Kimberly. Family members of the crew brought medical records of x-rays and dental records to law enforcement to help identify their missing family members. They were able to identify Michael Stewart, Mark Coulthurst's cousin, crew member of the Investor, by radiology records. They were also able to identify Jerome Keown. According to the coroner, they were dead before the fire and they were all drunk. Dean Moon and Chris Heyman were still missing, and so was 4-year-old Johnny Coulthurst. But in Craig, Alaska, people were talking. And as I've said before, in a town like this, someone knows something, and witnesses were coming forward left and right. One witness reported a man that purchased 2.5 gallons of gasoline. Another witness, well, two, the crew of a boat called the Casino, noticed smoke rising from the investor, and they were the first people to call it in. As they pulled from the dock to go towards the boat, the investor's power skiff passed them, and they hailed the operator and spoke with him briefly before going to the burning ship. They asked the man if people were on board, and he said, Yeah, there are. The man in the skiff pulled into the cold storage dock and spoke to at least 3 people. And then investigators say he slipped into a time warp at the end of the dock. A ton of witnesses would come forward and they would all mostly describe the same man. But besides knowing that the investor crew was killed with a .22 caliber rifle, there is almost no physical evidence at all. But someone somewhere knew something. And over the course of 2 years, the case investigators would not let this case go cold. And they had their eyes on someone. Someone they talked to the very next day after they found the burnt remains of 4 people on the investor. Police started to canvass the town looking for someone who matched the description. They had gotten the description of the skiffman from about 6 eyewitnesses. At the Hill Bar in Craig, they would find a man that fit the description, and he was acting nervous. He really stood out, and he fit the description of the skiffman to a T, minus the glasses. And what they did next, in my opinion, was so I don't have a word for it. I don't have a word for it. The police brought in 2 eyewitnesses that were completely terrified and had them mosey through the bar one at a time alone to see if they noticed the skiff operator, the guy that just murdered 8 people and has nothing to lose. Is this common practice? I feel like this is the first time I've ever heard anything like this, and I watch and read about a ton of cases. But anyway, they don't pick out the guy that fits the description. They don't pick out anyone, and it's revealed in archived case records that the witness was looking for specifics. One was looking for a specific shape, while the other was looking for those glasses that she remembered. One of the officers decided to see who the man was for himself. He went into the bar, and the man had moved. He had moved his seat to a different area. The officers asked the man for an ID, and he showed the officer his Washington State driver's license. His name was John Kenneth Peel. They told him someone matching his description was seen leaving the fire, and then he revealed that he knew the crew of the investor. They were friends of his. He had worked for Mark Coulter's during the previous season on his other boat, the Kit. Later, it would be revealed that not only did he know the victim, he was with the 2 deckhands from the investor, Jerome Keown and Dean Moon, the night they were last seen. John Peel used to date Mark's sister, and Mark had fired him, and as the case continued, more circumstantial evidence would present itself piece by piece. Police would interview John Peel at a hotel in Bellingham, Washington. He brought his wife with him to this interview. His wife, Kathy, seemed nervous. John Peel couldn't really tell them much about September the 5th, other than he went to sleep at 6 and on the Libby 8. This is his alibi, and this alibi will be shattered later. One thing of note is that they asked John if Mark allowed weapons on board, to which he answered, "When we were on the Kit, Dean Moon had purchased a rifle. He thought it was, quote, a .22 or something like that." A .22 was the murder weapon. That made my ear tingle a little bit. So John Peel said that he had purchased a .30-30 and that Dean Moon and John had bought them together at J.T. Brown's in Craig during the last season. The detective conducting the interview felt like something was amiss. Like Kathy was nervous and grew increasingly nervous during the interview. By the end of the interview, she was like wringing her hands uncontrollably. But maybe she's just a nervous person in general, or maybe talking to homicide detectives is just nerve-wracking. But the police had a feeling. a gut feeling. But gut feelings don't get indictments. So John Peel, in my opinion, looks exactly like the composite sketch of the Skiffman. So John Peel used to work for Mark Coulthurst, and Mark had fired him for being lazy, not showing up to work, or coming late. So that fishing season, John Peel decided to hitch a ride on a boat, the Cleveland, to Alaska to try to find work since Mark had fired him. So the skipper of this vessel, the Cleveland, that gave John Peel the ride, said during the long ride to Ketchiken, Alaska, John Peel stayed hitting the liquor. And one night, while he was quite drunk, he talked shit about Mark Coulthurst. Quote, "He badmouthed him in the strongest possible terms. And he meant it. There was anger in his voice." While in Ketchiken, he saw Mark Coulthurst and asked him to hitch a ride to Craig, and Mark said no. John Peel ended up pawning his watch for a plane ticket to Craig, and while he was there, he worked on the Libby 8 with his childhood friend Larry Demmert Jr. The night police believed that the investor crew were murdered, the Libby 8 was moored directly behind the investor. The investigators would talk to other fishermen and boat skippers as more evidence came in and more witnesses came forward. They started to develop a timeline of what they believed happened, and it all centered around John Peel. Craig is jam-packed with fishing vessels, and their crews are preparing for the last opener of the season. Openers are a time that fishing is permitted. Closures are a time where fishing isn't permitted. So during closures, all of the fishermen are in Craig. They are dropping off their loads to canneries or seafood buyers, doing boat repairs, net repairs, getting more provisions, getting sleep, taking a load off, or partying. It's Labor Day weekend. It's loud and busy. Generators are cranked up on every vessel. People are listening to music, cooking in the galleys of their vessels, getting hammered. A lot is going on. The last sighting of the Coulthursts alive seems to be the sighting of Johnny Coulthurst at 10:30 p.m. Sunday, September the 5th. The investigators say the Coulthursts and the crew were killed somewhere between 10:30 p.m. and 6 a.m. Larry Demmert Jr., the skippy of the Libby 8, reports seeing a party on the deck of the investor as he's returning back to the boat. He says no one is on the Libby 8 at this time, though John Peel says he was asleep on the Libby 8 at this time. We know earlier that night that Dean Moon and Jerome Keown, crew members of the investor, bought a few ounces of weed from John Peel, even though at first John Peel lies and says he never saw them. The state's theory is that John Peel went onto the investor with Jerome Keown and Dean Moon and got hammered with them, drank some liquor, smoked some pot, and John Peel got into an argument with Mark. And John Peel explodes and kills everyone aboard. So Larry Demmert Jr. says he hears pops and a scream at 2 a.m. He looks outside. Everything seems quiet and motionless. He opens the cabin door and he saw a man walking across the other boats. He noticed a blue cap with a marijuana leaf on it. He saw that it was John Peel. In his right hand, he was carrying a rifle. Irene Coulthurst was found wearing the same clothes that she wore to dinner that night. At 6 a.m. Monday morning, a member of the crew of the boat The Decade went outside to throw up and saw the investor drifting away. The investor's expensive lines had been untied and thrown onto the Decade's deck. The Decade's crewman waved at the man driving the investor, and the man waved back. At 7:30 a.m., a crewman on another boat noticed the investor anchored near Fish Egg Island. Around the time, another witness saw the skiff tied up at the storage dock. The state believes that while everyone lay dead, John Peel drove the investor out to Fish Egg Island and opened all the butterfly valves in an attempt to sink the ship, and it didn't work. So around 10:30, it's still there, and the investor's skiff was still docked at the cold storage dock. It was in the way, and it had to be moved several times. Curry, on the Decade, thought the investor had moved because their party was loud. He radioed the investor to apologize and got no response. The investor was also radioed about the tie lines, and they got no response. The next day, the investor is still anchored at Fish Egg Island. And to the killer's surprise, it hasn't sunk. So he drives the skiff back to the ship, throws around some gas, and by 4:20, possibly earlier, it's burning. Police knew that their suspect would know about boats. He would know how to operate them, know how to try to sink them, and they knew his description. Also, a part of the killer's profile was that he would know the victims. This was a personal crime, and any of the people on the investor, including the children, could have identified him. It had to be someone they knew. Before Larry Demmert Jr. turned, none of the witnesses could 100% say it was John Peel that they seen. They used words like most like or look similar, but they could never say that's him, except for one. One woman couldn't look at him in court and say that's him. She said real similar. But when the state showed her a photo of John Peel during the season, she said, I'd say that's a picture of the skiff operator. That's the skiff operator. And I believe her. I believe her because she was very careful not to point to the wrong person on many different occasions. She was very meticulous. John Peel would be tried for murders twice. The first trial would end in a hung jury. The second, he would be acquitted. The state's case had issues, but I don't think it was a weak case. Some of the witnesses were just not helpful. I would not even have called half of them to take the stand and testify. Like one of the crew of the Libby 8, Dawn, never would have used her as a witness. The Colthursts used to be her neighbors. She had sexual relations with both Dean Moon and John Peel. She had also interacted with Dean Moon and Jerome Keown the night the investor crew were believed to have been murdered. And she would testify to a grand jury that a very emotional John Peel confessed to her that he did it while he was crying, but then she recanted it. The crew of the Libby 8 just weren't cooperative. Another crew member, Brian, he was on the dock standing next to John Peel. He asked John what he thought happened. To that, John said, Mark probably wigged out and shot everyone. At this point, no one knew anyone was aboard, let alone dead, let alone shot. But Brian would change his testimony too. Dawn and Brian would say they were mistreated and intimidated by police. They would say things like, can't remember, could have, I don't know. That was basically their testimony at trial. I don't know, could have, can't remember. Vastly different than what they said at the grand jury hearing. One thing that didn't change was the fact that John Peel lied about his whereabouts on the night of the murders. He was not on the Libby 8 the night of the murders or the morning after. The other witness, Jim, the gas station owner that ID'd John Peel as the man who bought the gas, he was actually a fugitive from justice, wanted on an escape charge in Arizona. He had firebombed a car. Of all of the witnesses, two were very convincing: Larry Demmert Jr. and Sue. Larry would change his story multiple times, trying to protect his friend, but he is believable. Sue was also believable. The motive was called into question. Would someone kill 8 people, including a pregnant woman and 2 children, because he was angry that he was fired? Could jealousy and envy cause him to do it? The defense was weak. The defense lawyer was another story. Philip Widener was smart, dramatic, and he knew how to command a room. He was willing to take risks. He was willing to cross the line, but ethical he was not. It came out later that during the trial, he was banging or in a secret relationship with the presiding judge's clerk. This would actually get the judge removed for the second trial. Mr. Widener would end up fined multiple times. Protective orders had to be issued. He was the determining factor in both trials, but the defense itself was weak. The defense would have us believe that the crew of the investor were cocaine cowboys smuggling drugs, and their deaths were the result of a professional hitman. So I read this book called Angels to Ashes, and it's about the murders, and it's written by a guy named Michael McGuire, who was close to Larry Demmert Jr. and went up to Alaska during the first trial to support Larry. So he studied the case records, and he has a theory that it was drug related. So he found something in the case record that pointed the finger at John Peel and a guy named Bear. So the case files included some notes that detectives had jotted down. The notes say Peel led killers to the boat. Murders were over 12 pounds of cocaine. Bear, Panowski. And then there are other inmates involved. It's actually quite wild, and I don't think it's supported by the case files. So Mark Colchurst made a fortune fishing. He didn't let his crew smoke pot or drink alcohol while they were working, so I find it hard to believe that he would be running drugs on his $800,000 boat with his pregnant wife and children on board. And furthermore, I doubt he would risk his career, his fishing licenses. It's just not realistic. And moreover, John Peel's defense attorney loved to bring up the drug angle in court, but he was ultimately banned from mentioning drugs because he would not present any evidence to back this up, because there was none. What there was 3 jailhouse informants that tried to cook up a story to get out of jail. The story was investigated, and due to the findings, they dropped one of the informants from an unrelated murder case because he was obviously a liar and a fabricator. So the defense never called these witnesses because not only did these witnesses implicate John Peel as the person that led the hitman to the investor and said John Peel was the person that set it on fire, but because the state would have ripped them apart on the stand, and they knew it. That cocaine talk was his reasonable doubt, and he wanted to mention it without having to submit evidence about it. And it got the defense fined, and also a protective order was issued to keep the defense from mentioning such bullshit in the courtroom. But it was too late. You can't unhear something, and reasonable doubt is confusing. It basically means that you can't convict someone on a hunch or suspicion. You can't even convict someone if you think it's highly probable. You need to be convinced that the person did what they are charged with. In the first trial, 4 were convinced beyond a reasonable doubt that John Peel did this horrible thing. All statements, circumstances, and evidence always pointed to John Peel. Something that you didn't know are that police tested the weapons that were aboard the Libby 8. The weapons were submitted to the FBI, and both weapons were tested. One was ruled out, but the other came back inconclusive, which means it could have been or not. The FBI would later say they would never be able to match the murder weapon. And I'm thinking probably because the bullets were melted. But that was in 1984. It's 2020. Maybe they should try again. Another thing that you didn't know was John Peel tried to point the finger at Larry Demmert Jr. He said the photo sketch looks like Larry Demmert Jr. offhandedly. Could Demmert have been more involved than he said? I don't think so. John Peel could have just been pointing the finger at Demmert because he knew the rifle he used was aboard the Libby 8. Another thing you might not have heard is that the day that of the boat burning, John went to a payphone and called a travel agency. Another thing you might not have known is that John Peel was supposed to go back to Washington on the Cindy Sue with the crew of the Libby 8. It was a long-standing plan, but after he talked to the cops the day after the fire at the Hill Bar, he got on a plane and got out of Craig as fast as he could. Another thing you might not have known is that John Peel failed a lie detector test. And after he was heard to say, "I get it now, you're looking for a confession." Failing a lie detector test isn't concrete. It can't be used in court, but I mean, it's worth note. I just want to know, how could one man kill 8 people by himself? According to the sleeping arrangements and where the bodies were found, it seemed as though some people were shot in their bunks while they were sleeping. To kill so many people with a .22 rifle, he would have had to reload multiple times. Did he hold someone hostage while he did it? Was it a surprise attack? Investigators had a theory that he killed them one by one as they returned to the ship. However, the killer did it the killer was really angry, and his anger was directed at Mark. Mark Colthurst was shot in the face multiple times. But if the killer knew everyone on board, he had to kill everyone on board, because everyone on board could identify him. One of the issues the state had was the accelerant that was identified on the investor was white gas. And the gas station owner that identified John Peel, the gas station didn't sell white gas. White gas is the type of gas that's used in like Coleman stoves. However, the gas station owner said that John Peel bought the gas and put it in a jerry jug, and a jerry jug cap was found on the investor's skiff. And the state had an expert witness and an arson investigator that said that the accelerant was a mixture of both. Likely what happened, in my non-expert opinion, is that when the galley was ablaze, the investor's stove could have exploded. The other problem with the state's case was that Dean Moon and Johnny Colthurst weren't identified at the time, but there was a forensic anthropologist that was willing to testify that the bag of remains that he had were from 7 different people, which accounted for everyone except little Johnny. Little Johnny slept on the daybed in the wheelhouse most of the time, and that was the hardest hit area, and they believe his tiny body was completely consumed by fire. Keep in mind, the investor fire raged for over 4 hours and smoldered for days. One thing remains: the failure to shut down the airport and prevent people from leaving the island was a big mistake by investigators. The failure to fingerprint the skiff or the investor itself was another big mistake. I also never read of any executed search warrants or any gun residue testing or anything that could provide physical evidence other than the debrisement of the ship or the ballistics test. And not to mention, they let the boat continuously burn and smolder for days. My first thought upon reading about this was that John Peel didn't wear glasses. And all the people described the skiffman said he wore glasses. Like the first descriptions said that he wore glasses. So could the skiffman's glasses been a disguise? Could they have actually been the glasses of one of the victims? Could he have had them at the time? But he wasn't searched, patted down, nothing. The trials would cost the state of Alaska millions of dollars. And John Peel would file a lawsuit asking for like $175 million for wrongful prosecution. He would end up with $900,000. Not even 1% of what he asked for. But to those that think a mass murderer got away, it was another slap in the face. The state closed the case. They didn't investigate it further. One of the detectives said this of John Peel: "They got the right guy," McNeil says. "Just because someone is acquitted doesn't mean they're innocent. It just means there's not enough evidence to show guilt beyond a reasonable doubt." Whether John Peel did it or not, a murderer of 8 people is on the loose. And while this case is marked closed, the families of the victims have never gotten any closure or justice. If you want a more in-depth look at the investigation, trials, victims, and everything involved, then check out Leland Hale's book, What Happened in Craig, Alaska. Also, Angels in the Ashes is a book that provides an alternate theory. I would like to thank the Bellingham Hearld, Ketchiken Daily News, People Magazine, the Seattle Post, Alaska State Archives. Links to sources will also be available below. Until next time, I sleuth, you sleuth, we sleuth together.